Hello, good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tawny Holm. I'm the head of the Department of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and some people over Zoom for the first lecture in the 2024-2025 CAMPS Department Lecture Series. We're very excited to have Dr. Eric Cline join us today to talk about the collapse and survival of civilizations, not current collapse and survival, but the ancient world. But kinda, there are implications for today. Welcome to everyone who could join us here today. Welcome to Eric. Before we turn to the lecture, please let me introduce the Dean of our college to say a few words of welcome. Dr. Clarence Lang is the Susan Welch Dean of the College of the Liberal Arts. The college is a major co-sponsor of the events today, alongside the History Department, the Anthropology Department, the Jewish Studies Program, and the Central Pennsylvania chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America. So we're very grateful for all of that support, and we are especially grateful for Dean Lang's constant support and encouragement for all of our departmental endeavors and for this lecture today. Welcome, Dean.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. Welcome to Dr. Cline. Thank you to those of you for coming out to hear his remarks, and I hope engage in dialogue. This is a fantastic audience. I'm always positively impressed by the turnout at CAMS events. As someone was telling me, people in classics have to be very good at marketing themselves to make sure that the field survives, and so this is good. Our guest will receive a proper introduction shortly, but I want to acknowledge the work of the Department of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies for organizing this event. The other co-sponsors have been acknowledged, so I won't repeat that. But I will repeat that tonight's talk is part of CAM's lecture series this year titled Connected Histories of the Ancient Mediterranean and Near East, which is co-organized by Jake Nabel. So I want to acknowledge him as well as Rebecca Wang, both CAM's faculty members. So why is this important? I would first acknowledge that the subject matter here is certainly outside of my scholarly bailiwick, but I will say that as a college of the liberal arts, we are first and foremost concerned with comprehending the diversity, complexity, and richness of human experience, culture, and society across time and place. And at a moment when it feels like we, and by we I mean globally and domestically, are so intensely splintered, being able to imagine, articulate, and God forbid, act on our interconnections is a vital exercise, even if part of Dr. Cline's argument is that the interdependence of the ancient Mediterranean world was a very thing that hastened the collapse of this civilization, as I understand it. Now, to be sure, again, the Bronze Age, the Mediterranean are far outside my bailiwick as an historian. I will add that the contingent nature of history makes it difficult, at least in my opinion, to take events from the past and assume that they tell us something about the present or the future. But while I don't believe that history necessarily repeats itself, it does rhyme, I think. So we are wise to reflect on how human beings have managed societal collapse and threaded their way to resilience, adaptation, resurgence, and revival in the past. So for all these reasons, I'm glad that CAMS has organized this talk. I'm glad that our guest is here, and that, most importantly, you all are here for this event. And with that, I'm happy to hand things over to Jake, who will introduce tonight's speaker. One quick disclaimer, you all will see me exit. I was told by Dr. Cline that when you make an exit, you should slam the door so that people know that you mean it. I'll be departing, but not storming out, but there are other engagements that I'll have to get to. But I am going to hang out a little bit at the back. So I'm not leaving just yet, and I look forward to being able to hear some of the remarks. Thank you and welcome again. Jake, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dean Lang. We really appreciate your being here and helping us inaugurate this series. So very much appreciated. On behalf of my colleague and co-organizer, Professor Rebecca Wang, and also on behalf of my department, the Department of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to hear a lecture entitled 1177 BC and After the Collapse and Survival of Civilizations, presented by Dr. Eric Cline. Dr. Cline is professor of classical and ancient Near Eastern studies and also a professor of anthropology at George Washington University. He's also director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute in Washington, D.C. He is first and foremost an absolute leading authority in the field of ancient Near Eastern archaeology, with over 30 seasons in the field under his belt, directing both survey and excavation projects at countries all over the Eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt to Israel, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and even some in the United States as well. The list goes on and on. He's the author and/or co-editor of no fewer than 22 books, an absolutely staggering number, and countless articles and book chapters on top of that. And moreover, he is a frequent interviewee on TV documentaries that deal with various aspects of ancient history for broadcast companies like ABC, PBS, National Geographic, the History Channel, and many others besides. To reiterate and review in detail the many accolades that his work has earned and that his books have won over the course of his career would take a very long time. So let me simply mention one very important book in particular, which you see over here, which will be, by the way, on sale at the conclusion of the lecture this evening. 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. This was a hugely important work of scholarship for a couple of reasons, I would say. The first one is that it managed to distill and bring together an absolutely enormous volume of both textual and archaeological evidence from every corner of the Eastern Mediterranean and many lands beyond it besides. So Pharaonic Egypt, Kassite Babylonia in southern Mesopotamia, the northern Mesopotamian kingdoms of Mitanni and the Assyrians, the Hittites in Asia Minor, the Greeks, the Mycenaeans at the time, and Minoans in mainland Greece and on Crete. Simply a huge volume of evidence. And his sort of masterly control and proficiency over such a huge body of material and so many distinct bodies of evidence makes him, I think, an especially fitting speaker to inaugurate this series, Connected Histories of the Ancient Mediterranean and Near East, which is all about really breaking down what it can sometimes be a very, very stark and pronounced disciplinary boundary between the cultures of the ancient Near East on the one hand and the classical Mediterranean, Greece and Rome on the other. But 1177 was a very important book for another reason, and I have to say it makes it quite rare and unique among academic books, which is that it was written in such a way that people actually wanted to read it. And it caught a huge audience and ended up becoming a kind of runaway bestseller, if you will. The narrative of the book was gripping and compelling. Some of the characters of the late Bronze Age world that Dr. Cline describes in the book are very vividly and compellingly brought to life, and now match, I think, some of the treatments that the big names of ancient history like Alexander the Great or Cleopatra have received. And readers were really drawn in and immersed in this world, the late Bronze Age world, which was highly interconnected, was surprisingly cosmopolitan, and for, I think, a modern reader, quite strikingly, we could use the term proto-globalized, highly integrated and much more connected than modern readers tend to expect. It is no surprise that the book went on to be hugely successful, and to this day it has the distinction of being the best-selling ancient history book that Princeton University Press has ever sold. Another distinction it has, which again, not many academic books get this, is a graphic novel form. In 1177, its graphic novelization and the sequel will all be on sale after the conclusion of the lecture and the Q&A by the Squirrel and Acorn Bookshop, and we hope you'll be sticking around for that. Dr. Cline has very kindly consented to sign some copies after the event today is over. So before I welcome him to the stage, so to speak, let me just once more express our huge appreciation for the many co-sponsors we had for this event. First and foremost, the College of the Liberal Arts. Thank you, Dean Lang. Your support has been really invaluable. Also, we'd like to acknowledge the Departments of History, Anthropology, the Jewish Studies program, and the Central Pennsylvania chapter of the Archaeological Institute for America. It's a long list, but there were many people who were very excited to have Dr. Cline with us on campus. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium, Dr. Eric Cline.
All right, thank you very much. You can all hear me? Okay. All right, let me get this all set up. First and foremost, thank you for the introduction. There's no way I can live up to any of that, so I hope you will not be disappointed by what you're about to hear. So, secondly, thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Dean Lang. Thank you, Professor Holmes and Rebecca and Jake for my host. And I'm honored to be here as the first speaker in this series, which I must commend. Absolutely amazing series. And from what I've heard, the coming speakers will be pretty amazing. So you're in for a treat, this whole lecture series. So, and it's nice to see so many friends and colleagues and AIA members and students and professors from other departments. It's rather overwhelming, and it's wonderful to be here. Actually, I would say it's wonderful to be back, because I was here, I was just looking at my CV, I was here in January 2018, some of you may remember, to give the official original lecture on 1177 BC, and now you're going to hear the sequel, what happened afterwards. So what I propose to do, if you don't mind, I will spend, about the first 10 minutes or so going over again what happened with the collapse at the end of the Late Bronze Age, especially for those of you that were not here 6 years ago. Or have not read the book or whatever. I'll bring you up to speed on that, and then we will segue to what happened after 1177. And yes, there are repercussions for today, and I must say, Dean, you must be prescient, because that's going to be my last slide, that it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So keep your eyes out for that. I thought, aha. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to invoke your name at the very end, because you already anticipated where I'm going with this. Because I am a little worried about the same thing happening to us that happened to them back then. So these are the 3 books that have come out of this, and we will be going over that. But first and foremost, let me take you back 3,200 years, 3,500 years, to my favorite time period. And as many of you already know, that if I could be reincarnated backwards, which I know is impossible, but if I could, I would love to live back then. Would love to meet Shuppi-Luliuma and ask him if I'm pronouncing his name right. Love to meet Akhenaten and ask him what on earth was he thinking of when he did his religious revolution and all that. But I'm also sure I'd be dead in about 72 hours. But it would be a fun 72 hours. If I take out my contacts, I would probably walk off the nearest cliff, but it would be enjoyable. So let me take you back to that time period and introduce you, if you don't already know, to my friends, the G8 of the Late Bronze Age. And this includes Mycenaeans and Minoans over in the Aegean. It has the Hittites over in Anatolia, what is modern-day Turkey, It's got Cypriots in Cyprus, Egyptians in Egypt. It's got the Canaanites up and down the Levant. You've got the Assyrians and the Babylonians in Mesopotamia, basically modern-day Iraq. And all of these people are interacting at this time period. Now, even those of you that think you know nothing about this period, trust me, you do know already, because this is the Egyptian New Kingdom period. So how many have already heard of Hatshepsut, female pharaoh? Right, okay. How about her stepson, Tutmosis III, right? Amenhotep III, he's my favorite. Almost nobody will have heard of him, but some have. Akhenaten with his, right? Okay, good. You've probably not heard of King Tut. I'm going to guess that. I'd be wrong? Okay, all right, right. And then Ramses II, and our hero today, Ramses III. So the thing about that particular period, this is a small world network. And that is something my late wife, Diane, who passed away last year, she did social network analysis as well as archaeology and ancient history. So her period was 5th century Greece, and mine was 15th century. So my standing joke was I was 1,000 years older than she was. And she would look at me and go, yeah, and you look it. So on this, a successful marriage is built, right? So she at one point said to me when I was writing the original book that what I was discussing was a small world network. And I said, what's that? And she said, it's when everyone in the network is no more than 2 or 3 hops away from anybody else. So if anybody played the Kevin Bacon game, like name the movie that he was in and who was in it with them and all, same thing here. So if 2 people in this network were not in direct contact, they were in contact with an intermediary. So Mycenaeans were in contact with the Hittites, and the Hittites are in contact with the Assyrians. All right, if you have a network like that where there's nobody is more than 3 hops from anybody else, it's a small world network. Now, why does that matter? There are very few times in history that this has actually happened. Us today, of course, is one, and them back then was another. And this is why what happened to them, even though it's more than 3,000 years ago, I think may hold more lessons for us today than one might initially imagine. So what I'm going to present to you is what happened to them and then what happened afterward, and see if we can have some takeaways for what might be of use to us if we end up going down the same path. So I won't belabor the point here, but just a couple of pictures about the Late Bronze Age and the interconnections there, because as I just said, they're all in connection with each other. They're trading finished goods, they're trading raw materials like silver, gold, tin, copper, and so on. They're also trading things like finished Minoan sandals that make their way all the way to Mesopotamia and actually are sent to Hammurabi, the famous Hammurabi, the law code Hammurabi. And we're told in the text that he sent them back. And I'm like, why did he send them back? They were all the way from Crete. Were they too small? Maybe. Were they too last millennium? Maybe. And hadn't he ever heard of gift giving? But, or re-gift giving, something like that. Anyway, we've also got lots of tablets, the Amarna letters, the Mari letters, and all that. We know what's going on, and we even have shipwrecks, like the Uluburun shipwreck that went down in about 1300 BC. So these were all very interconnected, and indeed, the very thing that allowed them to rise up, I think in part, was also what started to bring them back down. Because what happened is just after 1200 BCE, everything that had been happily going around for up to 5 centuries at that point suddenly comes crashing down just in a couple of decades. Round about 1177 BC, by the time we get to 1100 BC, everything that they knew was basically in tatters in terms of the connected network, shall we say. So one of the big questions is, what caused that collapse? And that's where I came into the picture, because I think that the collapse at the end of the Late Bronze Age is as catastrophic as the fall of the Roman Empire, but my collapse is one that nobody outside of academia has ever heard of, right? Everybody's heard of the fall of the Roman Empire, but not the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. But the Late Bronze Age collapse happened about 1,500 years before the fall of Rome in the 5th century, and it's been about another 1,500 years since Rome fell. So I'm not saying that history repeats. but it might rhyme, and we might be due for another one. So I'm a little worried, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So this is where the books came from. And when Rob Tempio of Princeton University Press asked me to write a book about the collapse, I initially said, no, I don't want to. And he's like, why not? I said, because I'm not interested in the collapse. I'm interested in what collapsed. And he's like, you mean like Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, and all that? I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to write about. And so he said, I'll make you a deal. Begin and end the book with the possible reasons for the collapse. In the middle of the book, you can write about whatever you want. And I said, deal. So, and that's how the first book came around. And that was in 2014. But then immediately afterward, and I think it's just a coincidence, there was just a deluge of new publications, books, articles, you name it, with all kinds of new data, scientific data, literary data, all kinds of stuff. So by about 2019, I said to Rob, can we put out a new edition? And he's like, sure. So the revised edition came out in 2021 during the pandemic. And yes, it was shaped a little bit by the fact that we were all sequestered at that point. So I would say if you're going to read it, and I think we've got the revised edition for sale here, because I did change my mind a little bit, not much, but a little. And then finally, the graphic version, which is over there, also came out this past April. Absolutely amazing. 250 pages of full color comic book, and it's absolutely faithful to the original. Glynis Fox, who did it, both an archaeologist and a cartoonist, and she and I worked hand in glove over Zoom for 2.5 years to get this doing. We even introduced 4 new characters, 2 young kids, one Egyptian scribe, a young lady named Shisha, who can read and write absolutely everything, Egyptian, Ugaritic, you name it, and then Pel, short for Peleset, a young descendant of a sea person who can neither read nor write, and she eggs him on the whole time, right? And then also Glynis and I make appearances every so often. So you can actually play Where's Waldo with us and see how many times you can find us. But it's a lot of fun. It's meant for everything from the ages of 7 to 70. We're aiming for the new young market, and we're also aiming for the market that doesn't like to read but likes comic books. So hopefully we'll get both of those demographics. So what I did in that book, and again, I'm not going to belabor the point because you can buy it or read it or you've already read it. Sea peoples have been suggested, these invaders that came. Also drought's been suggested, famine, invaders, earthquakes. And when I was forced to choose these, my answer was yes. It's all of the above, right? It's a perfect storm. And what I was thinking is, look, when an earthquake hits, it'll damage everybody, it'll kill a lot of people, but it won't usually collapse your society. Same thing with drought, same thing with famine, same thing with you name it. But what if you have more than one, either at the same time or in rapid succession, such that you can't recover from one catastrophe before the next one hits? And after about the third or the fourth, you just throw up your hands and say, enough. And so that's what I think happened. And everything that's come out since 2014 has corroborated what I suggested. So I call it a perfect storm. I also call it a series of unfortunate events, if that rings a bell with some of the people. With my publisher, I try and slip phrases in. So Lemony Snicket made it into the book. Also, at some point I said, I was talking about the Assyrians conquering, and I said resistance was futile, which some people will recognize that. Right, so anyway, I had fun with that. And that data that came out after 2014, I just want to show you very quickly some of it. For example, this map, which came out in 2019, is of the evidence for drought. And every place that you see a red dot is another scientific study that's been published indicating that there was a drought that stretched from, in modern terms, from Italy on one side to Iran on the other, and from Turkey down to Egypt. And that drought lasted minimum of 150 years, maximum 300 years. This is a mega drought. All right? And so the new evidence is from everywhere. Stalagmites in caves, sediments at the bottom of lakes, dried up lagoons, you name it, ancient pollen and all of that. So it's pretty conclusive. The famine also Now we have more textual evidence for it. One of the things that happened is that the French, who were excavating at Ugarit, published more letters in 2016 in French. And then my friend Yuri Cohen published a translation in English. And so here's one example of the Pharaoh of Egypt, Merneptah, writing back to the king of Ugarit, which is on the coast of what is today northern Syria. And he's quoting back a letter that the Ugaritic king sent to him. And he said, "You wrote to me, in the land of Ugarit there's severe hunger. May the king give grain to save my life." So famine in Ugarit, absolutely. We've got textual evidence for it now. And that was one of the reasons why the revision came out. I had dinner with Yuri after our 2019 field season at Cabri, which is very close to Akko, where Professor Ann Killebrew has her excavations. And Yuri said to me, "The French have published more tablets. You have to come out with a new edition of your book." And I'm like, "Okay, no problem." And we went from there. So famine is one. We also already had letters from the Hittite kings and one queen talking about a famine up in Hittite Anatolia. Invaders, famous text talking about the sea peoples, which I won't go into detail here, but happy to talk about in the Q&A afterward if we want to talk more about them. They come twice, 1207 and 1177 BC. That's where the title of the book comes from. They lose both times. The Egyptians beat them, or so they say. Right? They do not come back a third time. But now again, we have more text. This is another one of the letters that the French published, where it is from the last king of Ugarit, writing and saying to the Hittite viceroy up at Carchemish, "I wrote to you 2 times, 3 times news regarding the enemy. They have overrun the port, which is Ras Ibn Hani, and they are now on their way to Ugarit, so please send reinforcements." So now we know that somebody attacked Ugarit, which we had already thought, because the reinforcements, if they were sent, didn't get there in time. When the French excavated Ugarit, they found a meter of destruction right there. The city had been burnt to the ground and was uninhabited for something like 400 years afterward. So the main problem is he only says the enemy. I really wish he had said the Peleset or the Shardana or somebody, but no, the enemy is all we get. So it was so close and not quite. So we got invaders, still have evidence for earthquakes, even more evidence now as well. And then added into all this, the other horsemen of the apocalypse, we now know that there was disease there as well, which was not a surprise. This is the mummy of Ramses V, and if you look closely along his jawline, you can see that he had smallpox. And there is a papyrus in the Turin Museum in Italy that talks about him and the other members of the family dying from smallpox. They dug new tombs for them in the Valley of the Kings, and then gave the workmen a month off at full pay and closed the Valley of the Kings for 6 months. It's probably the world's first quarantine. So we've got disease added in there as well. And what this all leads to is very simply a systems collapse, which we've been talking about such things since the days of Colin Renfrew at Cambridge in the late 70s. It's basically when your central administration collapses, so does your centralized economy. The elite, the 1%, they go away, they either die or migrate, and your population declines. So that's what we see here. Systems collapse usually takes up to a century, and we are no different. It takes most of the 12th century for this to happen. So 1177 is actually a clickbait title, if you will. It's not the year civilization collapsed, it's the year the Sea Peoples came the second time. But it's shorthand for the collapse, just like 476 AD is sometimes used as shorthand for the fall of Rome. So 1177 is for this. So what is important for us today and for the sequel and everything else is that the world as they had known it since about 1700 or 1500 BC changed and it transformed. And so we had people like the Hittites ruling in Anatolia, and in the aftermath of the collapse, it changes to much smaller kingdoms and city-states in the Iron Age. And so in the sequel, after 1177 BC, the survival of civilizations, I'm asking, how did we get from the left-hand picture to the right-hand picture, right? How did we get from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age? And so what I did originally when I wrote the book, my penultimate draft, which I was about to send to Rob at Princeton, was chronological. I went 12th century, 11th, 10th, 9th, 8th, just like I had done chronologically in the first book. And then as I was reading it over, I got what I would call literary whiplash. Not just literal whiplash, but literary whiplash, because like chapter 2 on the 11th century, I'm like, so Assyria, no, Babylonia, no, the Cypriots, no, Egypt. And I'm like, whoa, I couldn't keep track of what I was saying, and I thought this is not going to work. So I tried an experiment. Let me rearrange it geographically. And I suddenly went, bingo, that's it. Because we have 8 case studies of what to do or what not to do if your society and your globalized network of connections should happen to collapse. So now chapter 1 is Egypt and Canaan. Chapter 2 is Assyria and Babylonia. Chapter 3, Cypriots and Phoenicians. Chapter 4, the Hittites and the Neo-Hittites. 5 is Mycenaeans and Minoans. And then that's basically a history book with archaeology. So if you don't know much about this period, there you go. You'll be an expert by the time you finish it. Chapter 6 is the analysis. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I'm not going to go through the first 5 chapters, in part because we've got experts in this very room that would be sitting here going, yeah, you messed that one up. No, that wasn't like that. No, no, no. So I'm going to skip right to the analyses because there's going to be enough discussion that comes out of that. And I'm going to be very curious to see what you agree with and what you disagree with, because I am expecting pushback from some people for this. So the first thing that I was trying to look at, and which we can talk about in the Q&A, is the pushback I got after the first book came out, with some people saying, it's not actually a collapse. It's actually just a transformation. You're exaggerating it. And I'm like, I don't think I'm exaggerating it. In Greece, somewhere between 40 and 60% of the people either died or migrated. And there's been estimates that in Mesopotamia, up to 75% of the people died. I'm like, that's not a transformation. That's like a collapse. And they're like, nah, I don't know, it's more like a transformation. But, so I was trying to figure out which one it was, or is it both? And what I would say is, for example, look at the high digital photograph right there. If you zoom in, it gets pixelated. That's what happens when you look at a collapse, not just the late Bronze Age, but any collapse. And this is what Norm Yaffe and Patricia McEnany pointed out way back when. They said, anytime you look at a collapse from far away, you can see that there's a big change. When you get right up close, then you go, wait, that's not quite right, that's not quite right. So I actually think it's closer to an Impressionist painting, that when you're far away, you can see the whole picture, no problem. But if you get right up close, you sometimes just see the dabs of paint, right? What's that saying about losing the forest for the trees and all of that? So what I've decided, I want my cake and eat it too. It's both a collapse and a transformation. What collapses is the network that connected them. That for sure, that network collapses. Each of the societies then, it's up to them whether they survive or not, whether they transform or not. Some of them were able to do it successfully, others were not. And so what I want to do then is walk you through those. Now, fortunately, in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of interest in the collapse of societies. And it basically started with the top right-hand book by Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies. But most people are probably more familiar with the one in the bottom of row, Jared Diamond, Collapse. How many people have read that or looked at it or heard of it or anything like that? He's the one that popularized the whole bit of collapse. Now, what's happening now, though, is the archaeologists in particular are getting more interested in what happens after collapse. What do you do after you've collapsed? So now we're getting edited volumes of conference papers like Beyond Collapse and After Collapse. And I think this is in part what's going to be important for us today. Because hand in hand with that goes this whole idea of resilience. Right now, how many have heard somebody use the term resilience in the last month? right? You're hearing it everywhere, right? How about the last 6 months, right? Last year, right? We're talking about resilience all the time now, especially in the aftermath of hurricanes like Helene and Milton. They're talking about, is there going to be resilience? Are they going to bounce back? And it really started, I think, after Katrina in New Orleans. So the problem is, depending on who you talk to, you get a different definition of resilience. Everybody's got their own definition. And it got so bad at one point that the Department of Homeland Security in 2011 asked the National Research Council to put together a definition that we could all work with. And they came up with one I like. It's when you can continue to operate under stress, adapt to adversity, and recover functionality after a crisis. I think that pretty much covers what resilience can be. But I would also ask if the collapse that we're seeing might not just be part of the natural order of things. And I show you here what's called the adaptive cycle, figure 8 on its side, but it basically says, look, all empires rise and all empires fall. Everybody has done that, right? It comes from biology, it comes from environmental stuff, but we've started adapting it and adopting it in archaeology as well. And the basic idea is that you can continue up here with your conservation, but when you get down lower right to the omega cycle, that's the release. That's when you get a collapse. But then you come back and you get up to the top left to the alpha, and that is when you reorganize. And that's a period of inventiveness and innovativeness. And so I think we've got late Bronze Age collapse in lower right, and we've got Iron Age in the top left. But it's if you are resilient. So basically, empires rise, empires fall, or to quote Hamilton, ocean rise, empires fall. Anybody seen Hamilton? Anybody watching on Disney Plus and all? We watched it again and again and again and again through pandemic. And we decided that there is a line from Hamilton for every situation. So I used it in here. And I actually, in the sequel, there's at least 2 quotes from Hamilton, if not 3. So if you get the book, text me and tell me if you found them. Right? So again, I slipped them in. Right. But the other thing about this is even if your overall cycle is rising and falling, so are the internal components. And this is called panarchy. They're all on their own system. So Mycenaeans are rising and falling. Egyptians are rising and falling. And I think it's like a pocket watch. If all the gears are working, then your watch keeps time, no problem. But what if one of the gears malfunctions? It throws absolutely everything off. And that's all you need. So that's the other question, is to ask, what's happening with the individual societies? And that's why the geographic division of the chapters, I thought, worked much better than chronology. Now, the other thing that I tossed into the equation, and I was wary about this, I'm still wary about this, because it may be taking something from us today and putting it back on them back then, which is not appropriate, but I think it is. And this is from the IPCC. How many people have run into the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Right, they won a Nobel Prize back in 2007, and they put out things absolutely every year. In 2012, they put out this, which to me resonated. It was the first time they talked about extreme events and disasters in connection with climate change. And in this book, they used all kinds of definitions, which I suddenly went, wait, that fits with the Bronze Age collapse and afterward. So, give you the main example. They define an extreme impact event as something that can be the result of a single extreme event or the persistence of conditions like drought. And I thought to myself, if the IPCC people had been talking about archaeology, which they never do, and I were to say to them, hey, what about the late Bronze Age collapse? They would have said, for sure, that's an extreme impact event, absolutely. And then, once having made that definition, you talk about the capacity to recover from an extreme impact event. And there are basically 3 categories. If you're just living for tomorrow, you're just trying to make it through today and get to tomorrow, you're coping, right? Sometimes that's all you can do. But if you are focused on a little further out, a month out, a year out, you are actually doing more than coping, you're actually adapting. right? So you're doing a little bit better. And if you're looking to the future and you're saying something like, that can never happen again, we can never let New Orleans be flooded after a hurricane, you are then on the road to transforming, right? And so this is, 1, 2, and 3. And so I thought, well, what if we apply this to 1177 and afterward? So I put a table in the sequel, putting all the definitions in, and you'll notice down bottom, I was very careful to give my sources. So if you want, you can go and look them up yourself. But then what I did was say, okay, of the 8 societies, where do they fit in? Who transformed? Who adapted? Who coped? And I was able to put them into this nice little table. And so I think, for instance, the Canaanites in central Canaan, which is today Lebanon, they become the Phoenicians, and they are among the most resilient. Same with the Cypriots on Cyprus. I think they did the best. Then I think we've got Assyria and Babylonia, and the Neo-Hittites up in North Syria, northern Canaanites. Egypt, I think they're resilient, but only just barely. They're kind of like coping. And here's where I'm expecting the Egyptologists to go, wait, we're not number 3. We're at least number 2, if not number 1. Right? And I actually had an Egyptologist in Prague in July who stood up and yelled, we're number 1 or we're nothing. And I'm like, look, dude, maybe number 2, but you're lucky you're not number 4, okay? Right? And he's like, oh, okay, right. So Mycenaeans and Minoans, I think they are in number 4. They're not resilient, but there is continuity. And then number 5, Hittites and Southern Canaanites. Don't be a Hittite. All right. Southern Canaanite, I'm also open to discussion because I almost at one point had the Southern Canaanites up in number 2, and then I put them back in number 5. But if somebody is willing to give me a good argument, I might put them up back in number 2. So let me just show you briefly in the time remaining why I put each one of them into these categories, and then you can tell me if you agree or disagree. So the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, I actually think that they are so resilient that they are anti-fragile, which is a definition I borrowed from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's the same guy that popularized a Black Swan event, if you remember that, right? So he had a book called Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. It means when you flourish in an age of chaos, you actually take advantage of the chaotic conditions. Sorry about that, that's my alarm. I know I've got about 10 minutes left. I may be dating myself with that, right? How many people have Indiana Jones as their ringtone? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, or your alarm? Okay, some of you, excellent, good, good, good. All right, we have to spread that. That has to become a thing, right? Okay, so I know I've got about 10 more minutes, and then I will open it up to questions or so. So Taleb was saying that anti-fragile, you flourish in the age of chaos. And I actually think the Phoenicians took advantage of Ugarit being burnt to the ground and helped to sail the Mediterranean such that it became a Phoenician lake, as one of my colleagues has called it. And that is in part, let's see, in a minute. Are you seeing that too? Yes, I am too. Can we get rid of this? There we go. There we go. All right. Among other things, the Phoenicians spread their alphabet, right? You're all familiar with the Phoenician alphabet, or you should be, because it went to Greece, became the Greek alphabet, went to Italy, became the Latin alphabet, and we're still using that today to write English and French and German and Spanish and all of that. So they are spreading it. They don't invent the alphabet, but they standardize it, and then they spread it. And also purple dye, same thing. They standardize purple dye and spread it. We now know the names of a lot of the Phoenician kings, and of course, bear in mind, they did not call themselves the Phoenicians. That's what the later Greeks called them. They would have said, oh, I'm from Tyre, I'm from Beirut, I'm from Byblos, whatever. But so we know the names of many, many, many of the kings. Now, I think Cyprus is similar to that, but for a different reason. The Cypriots had been the main place to get the copper in the Bronze Age, and they were at the leading edge of making bronze and all that. I think that they are the ones that switched first to making iron, that they've already, it's been suggested that already they learned, maybe accidentally at first, how to do iron, but then by the time we get into the Iron Age, they're making things like the picture you see up top. I apologize, very bad picture. It is a knife with the blade made of iron, but the rivets in the handle are made out of bronze. It's what's called a bimetallic knife or dagger. You can also make tools like this, and the Cypriots export these both over to Greece on one side and over to the southern Levant on the other. They're the first ones. They first appear on Cyprus, then they appear elsewhere. So they're obviously sending them out. But they're being nice about it, too, because they're spreading the technology at the same time. They're telling people, oh, you like this? Here's how you make it. And everybody has iron ore in their countries, and you can see one by one, everybody learning how to do the iron smelting. So the Cypriots, I think, are also very resilient, anti-fragile. And in fact, everywhere we see Phoenician stuff in the Aegean, we also see Cypriot. So either they're working hand in hand or maybe they're competitors. We don't know. But they both make my top category. And I would remind you, this is where that alpha phase comes in because it's a period of innovation and invention. And I think both the Phoenicians and the Cypriots do that. All right, so category 2, and again, I will go through this very quickly, but Assyrians and Babylonians, Neo-Hittites, Northern Canaanites. The Assyrians and Babylonians do well overall, in part because they're inland. They are not susceptible to the invaders of the sea peoples and all that. They're also on the Tigris and Euphrates, which means they have a large water source. But even they are impacted by the drought. It's 50 to 75 years later than anybody else. But one of the Assyrian texts tells us that they are starving so much they've resorted to cannibalism. So even they are impacted. But then they bounce back, and certainly by the 9th and into the early 8th centuries, of course, the Neo-Assyrians have conquered the entire ancient Near East and have made it their little playground. All of their former commercial partners, they are now just taking what they want by force. And again, we know all of their kings. We've got all of their records, but you have to take what the Neo-Assyrians say with a grain of salt, right? Because here, this is Shalmaneser III showing him at Tyre, where he's getting tribute from the Phoenicians. But on inscriptions like this, the Black Obelisk, which is in the British Museum now, he shows Jehu, the son of Omri, bowing down to him. He talks about the Battle of Karkar in 853, where he says he killed 14,000 enemy soldiers, so many of them that he dammed up the Orontes River. Now, I would suspect that might be hyperbole, but never mind. So I would take what the Neo-Assyrians say with a grain of salt, but still, they did conquer most of the Near East. So I put them in category 2. The Egyptians, I put them into category 3. They coped, but they were not very resilient. They continued on, but they were not like they were back in the New Kingdom period. For one thing, we've got, you can see the names of the kings on the right. We've got several kings ruling at the same time. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3. At one time, there was 4 kings, each ruling in a different part of Egypt. This is the 3rd intermediate period of Egypt, which was already kind of a period of anarchy and such. So I'm not surprised by this, but I have been told, shall we say, by Egyptologists that perhaps comparing them to the New Kingdom is not fair. And maybe I should just consider the 3rd intermediate period on their own. And I'm like, yeah, they also retreated from the world stage. So there is that. So again, lucky that they're not in 4. And, wish for number 2, but for now, number 3. But that's not to say there aren't high points. For example, the so-called Silver Pharaoh, which I guarantee almost nobody has heard of, absolutely amazing burial. It's the 2nd richest in all of Egypt, behind King Tut. But because he was found in 1939 as World War II is breaking out, nobody's ever heard of him. But he was ruling at this time. If you have heard of anybody, it would be Sheshonk, who might be Shishak of the Bible, who came up and conquered, campaigned in Canaan, even getting to Megiddo at one point. So there are high points. So I thought 3 was fair, right? So just kind of coping. The people that don't cope, Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland and the Minoans on Crete. By about the middle of the 11th century, 1050 BC, they're gone. There are people that survive, don't get me wrong, there are people that are still living, but they are no longer recognizably in a Mycenaean society or a Minoan society. It is kind of a permeable membrane, if you will. Some stuff makes it through. The names of the gods and goddesses, for example. We know they were already worshiping Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and Athena back in the Bronze Age, and of course those make it through, no problem. But some things do change. Back in the Bronze Age in Greece, for example, the head king was the Wanax, and a lower administrative guy was the Basileus. In the Iron Age, Wanax is gone. There's nobody. There's no Wanax. And the Basileus is now elevated to be a king. So it is a permeable membrane. But Mycenaean society kind of goes away. The one thing that people say, and you'll see it all over the internet, is that the collapse in Mycenaean Greece was caused by the Dorian invasion. Right? How many have run across that at some point in their lives? And the story is the Dorians came down from the north with weapons of iron and they overran. There's absolutely no evidence for that. None. Right? I mean, none. Like zip. Nada. Nothing. Forget about it. There might be a migration, but there's not an invasion. It's been called an amazing invasion with no invaders. And archaeologists have been fighting against this since the 60s, but it's still in the textbooks. It's still all over the internet. So I actually begin the sequel with that, trying to dismiss the Dorian invasion. That and doing away with the term Dark Ages, because I don't think this is a Dark Age. I want to call it the Iron Age instead. Anybody that's got alphabet and iron, that's not a Dark Age, right? It's a period of inventiveness. So anyway, but the Mycenaeans, as I say, they go all the way down. They have to rebuild. They're starting basically from scratch again. Same thing with the Minoans, but again, archaeology keeps adding to our knowledge. And so we're still finding things like Knossos on Crete, where King Minos supposedly was. Iron Age Knossos was bigger than we thought. We just figured this out in the last decade or so. And so, in fact, Sarah Wallace, she said at one point, Iron Age Crete is a positive collapse. How do you have a positive collapse? Collapse is inherently negative, but no, on Crete it's positive. It's because they were able to resurrect. But archaic Crete is very different from Minoan Crete, even though there are the survivors. So I asked Glynis, the one who did the cartoon, the graphic version, if she could put this into the adaptive cycle. And so we've got late Bronze Age, the collapse, and then the Iron Age. I think this actually does work. Okay, and then on our final category, we've got the Hittites. Don't be a Hittite. They do not survive. Their economy goes away. The society goes away. The only thing that survives are the Neo-Hittites in northern Syria. So as you can see, they go down and just flatline. Right? So, but what we've got is all kinds of evidence for why it happened. And I think they were more vulnerable or fragile than they appeared to the outsiders. So we now have new evidence from Stuart Manning and his colleagues for a drought up in Anatolia, actual scientific evidence, not just the textual. But we also know that Hattusos was abandoned. The capital city was abandoned by the royal family before the end came. And we know from the text that there was actually a feud in the royal family with the split. So I think they were destined for, if not collapse, they were destined for some hard times already. And in fact, the Hittite Empire is then replaced by other entities like Urartu in the west and the Phrygians in the east. But they're Neo-Hittites. The part of the Hittite Empire in North Syria, that did survive. And I would equate it with the British Empire, which no longer exists anymore, but there are still parts in this world where people drink tea and play cricket that had been formerly in the British Empire. Same thing here with the Neo-Hittites. They continue the tradition. They're actually ruled in some cases by descendants of the Hittite royal family, and they are still writing in Luvian, which is the royal language. They're still worshiping the gods and goddesses. For all intents and purposes, they are the Hittites in this new era. And I think when the Bible refers to the Hittites, that it's referring to the Neo-Hittites. That's what makes sense to me, because the original Hittites are long gone. And here again, we know the names of many of these Neo-Hittite kings from their various small city-states. And I would recommend to you one of the most recent books by James Osborne at Chicago, who has written about all of these. Very, very thorough book. But I also wanted to point out one of the later kings who left us his statue. And did he think this was a good portrait? Right? Okay, yeah, perfect. I love it. I love it. Just, yeah. Okay, fine. Right. Okay. So the other thing, though, is in southern Canaan. The northern Canaanites did fine. The central Canaanites, the Phoenicians, did incredibly fine. What about the southern Canaanites? Well, down there, we get new groups now. We get the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. We get Aram, we get Ammon, we get Moab, we get the Edomites. So what goes on there? This is where some of the newest work has been going on, with Erez ben Yosef and Tom Levy suggesting that there had been nomads there. Like the Edomites, they said they were nomadic. When the Egyptians pulled out of the area in about 1140, they said the Edomites settled down, took control of the copper, and bingo, you get the kingdom of Edom. And they said maybe this happened elsewhere, and they've actually extended it into the Israelites now as well. But that's my other question, is where's the Israelites in all of this? When did they come into Canaan? Were they already there? Did they come in at this point? And there are all kinds of suggestions, as many of you know. And so I left them out of my table. I think they came in at this time as part of the migrations that happened. But if Israel Finkelstein is right and they were already there in the highlands, then maybe they transformed. But what also happened to the Canaanites that were there? Right, in the Bronze Age, you have Canaanites at Megiddo and Hatzor and Lachish and Jerusalem, and now suddenly you've got all these new little kingdoms. So what happened to the Canaanites? Were they killed off? Were they assimilated? Right, and the two books in the Bible say different things, Judges and Joshua, or should they not even be there? So that's why I went back and forth with where should the southern Canaanites be? Are they already there and they really transformed and did a great job? And they're up in number 2, or did they essentially disappear and they're down in number 5? So I currently put them in 5, but I'm expecting colleagues like Ido Koch and other people to come back and no, we're up in 2. I'm like, maybe could we say 3? We'll put you in with the Egyptians? We'll see. So I think that what my book is going to do is start the debate, not end it, and that was the idea. And indeed, we've already got new other data. Daphne Longut, for example, and her team now is saying, actually, that 150 to 300 year drought, she's like, there is a respite in the middle of it when the rain came back for a while and they could plant olives again. And she said, that's about the time when the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah came into being. And actually, the same thing is up in Mesopotamia. The Assyrians seem to have benefited from that same mini climate change before it went bad again. So there's new data coming out all the time. So I would end by saying, obviously, the aftermath was varied. It was far more nuanced than even I had supposed. And so I had to walk back some of the things, the catastrophic things that I said in the first book. I'm like, ma'am, I do not think it was a transformation. It was definitely a collapse, but there might have been some transforming too. So there's something in there. But definitely Phoenicians, Cypriots, Assyrians, Babylonians, I think did the best of anybody. Egyptians, meh. And then Hittites, Mycenaeans, Minoans, and the others, not so well at all. But we also see new entities. It is definitely a new world in the Iron Age, very different from the Bronze Age, which is why I do think you do need that divide between the two. As to why the differences, well, that's a problem and a whole nother lecture. So, if I come back, I can do that. And I do think that some of them are more vulnerable and fragile than others. But I would like to ask what made the Cypriots and Phoenicians so much more successful than anybody else. And I don't think there's a simple answer, but the Phoenicians and Cypriots were innovative, and I think that was very important. The Assyrians and the Babylonians were by water sources, like I said, Tigris and Euphrates, far inland. The Egyptians, even though they're by the Nile, there's a lack of rainfall up in Ethiopia, which impacts the Nile. And they also had a whole series of weak rulers, all the other Ramses, all the way up through number 11. And I think the Mycenaeans might have overexploited the lower classes. And they might have, as they say, overreached or overshoot in good times. And then when the bad times came, they couldn't do it. And as I said, I think the Hittites were more vulnerable than they might have appeared. So I wanted to leave the readers with a takeaway, so I gave them a table with 7 common sense things for lessons learned from all of this. And as I say, they're very common sense, but we could use them if something happens to us, for example. I would say first and foremost, have multiple contingency plans, not just a plan A and a plan B, but have it a plan C, D, E, and F that you can go to. I also think you need to be pretty resilient and strong enough, but you do need to call upon your friends if you're not as self-sufficient as you should be. I do think you need to be innovative, and these days I would say things like rare earth and lithium and all of that have me concerned with computer chips and all of that. So we might need to invent new stuff. Also with the extreme weather conditions, and in particular with the hurricanes that just came, my personal feeling is prepare for it, because if they come, you might be ready. If they don't come, so what? You haven't lost anything. But you also need dependable water. And I've been told by people high up in the government that that's where the wars for the next century may be fought, is over water supply, and we're already seeing things like that. And then, of course, the historians will know, always keep your working class happy or bad things happen. So as I say, common sense, but I think it would work. So I will end with a question that I actually asked last time as well in 2018. Are we currently facing a similar situation to that faced in 1177? And 6 years ago, we decided yes. I would today say yes with a bullet. Absolutely. We've got climate change, famines and droughts, earthquakes, rebellions, disease, migrants, and refugees. We've got everything they had in 1200 BC, and they collapsed, which is why I'm a little bit worried, especially with everything that's happening today, right? You remember the supply chain shortages when that ship blocked the Suez Canal? And remember with the pandemic when everybody went and bought toilet paper, right? It's like, whoa, okay. So if we do collapse, and actually I would say it's not if, I would say when we collapse. I just think it's a matter of time. I've suddenly found myself becoming a Cassandra, but I am very pessimistic. Are we going to learn any lessons? And more importantly, are we going to turn out to be Phoenicians, or are we going to be Mycenaeans? Are we going to be anti-fragile, or are we going to disappear? Future historians obviously are going to have to answer that. And I would quote John Wooden from UCLA, who I watched in the last 2 years of him coaching the Bruins. And he used to say, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Apparently, some guy named Benjamin Franklin used to say that as well, but he was before my time, whereas I knew John Wooden. So, and I will end with the same thing that the dean opened with, and remind you that Mark Twain said, history might not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I personally think that we are in the middle of a rhyme. And I will leave you with that thought. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cline, for that tour de force through the Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean. We will have a Q&A now, but just a couple of announcements and points of order. We'll have a Q&A for about half an hour until 6:30 or so. At that point, my colleague, Professor Wang, will head out to the front of the library and will relocate for a reception in Dr. Cline's honor, a catered reception with food. And as long as you've registered, you're welcome to join us at that. Dr. Cline has also very kindly consented to sign copies of his book, which again, I remind you, not only the sequel, but the prequel and the graphic novel are all for sale. Thanks to Squirrel and Acorn.
All yours
that.
for the low, low price of.
That's right. Competitive prices. So we will stick around, and at the conclusion of the signing, however long that takes, I'll bring a final group over. The reception is in the Marriott Foundation building, which is just behind the Nittany Lion Inn, should you be interested in joining. So let me open the floor to questions. I just ask that I'll bring around the microphone, and I'll just ask that question askers use it for the benefit of the Zoom audience. So the floor is open.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. You mentioned that the origin of the Israelites might have been a situation where they took advantage of the Philistines just coming into the land, and that Israelites might have migrated there. In that case, where do you think Israelites might have come from originally if they didn't originally come from Canaan?
All right, so now you're getting into a whole nother question and a whole nother lecture, right? Was there an exodus and did it happen? And if so, what? So personally, and again, this is a whole nother lecture, but to make it simple, I would say that if there were something like an exodus, and I do think something happened, I'm not sure it happened the way the Bible described it, I would say the best time period for it is right at this point, from about 1250 BC on. I think that if they're coming up from Egypt, that they are taking advantage of the chaos. For example, I don't think the Israelites could have defeated the Canaanites on their own, but what if the Canaanite cities were already smoking ruins because of the sea peoples or whatever? Then I think that would have fit in. But if they are in there earlier, and like 1450 BC, which if you follow the biblical chronology should be that, or if they're already up in the highlands, then they're coming down from there. I don't have what's the saying? I don't have a dog in the race. I don't have a horse in the race. So I don't really care which one it is, but I would like to know if they're already there or if they come in at this point. For all the other groups, it's been suggested they come in or settle down like they were nomads or they came from elsewhere. So I actually think this is the perfect time for the Israelites to come in. And if that's the case, why not? They're coming from Egypt. Why not? But that we need to settle that question. And we've already been arguing about it for 100 years. I don't know we're going to settle it anytime soon. But one of these days we will.
Any more questions?
You mentioned innovation as well as the exploitation of the middle class. Innovation as something to keep society running, kind of, and the exploitation is something that would lead to collapse. Do you think there's a line between over-innovation where we start to lead into exploitation? And when do you think they hit it back then? And do you think we're hitting it now in the modern day?
Like too much innovation and leading to over-exploitation?
Like leading to like the exploitation of the middle class, where we're making new things constantly and exploiting the middle class to make them.
Yeah, that's a good question. Especially if you think that maybe the Mycenaeans had done something like that, exploiting the middle or lower class. That's something you always have to watch out for. I personally, though, think in terms of chaotic conditions and such, and supply chain shortages and all that, I think innovation and invention are good. In the aftermath, who knows? But I specifically think, just like when I was growing up, oil was what we were worried about, and I grew up in the gas embargo in the 70s and all that. I now think that we've got a similar problem with, like I said, lithium and rare earths. So I do think we need to be ready to turn on a dime and maybe figure out something else that's going to be useful going forward. Hopefully that will not involve the exploitation or over-exploitation, but that would be something that we need to keep an eye on, right? But first and foremost, I'd like to see some more inventions and innovations come forward before it's too late, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I found that incredibly fascinating. When you mentioned the Ethiopian highlands, and rains and lack thereof, I was wondering if you could, like, it occurred to me if you could speak a little more about the absence of Nubia in your model of sort of interconnectivity. I mean, I'm no Egyptologist, but I mean, from what little I know about the time, right, interconnectivity along the Nile Valley, like further south into the African continent, is pretty well established, and you could argue that the Nubians ultimately were the anti-fragile people in the 25th dynasty, you know, when they take over Egypt. I was just wondering how you see that dynamic working, the Nubians' place in the system or the reason for their absence,
Right.
et cetera, et
So
cetera.
from my point of view, it's a simple answer. The absence of Nubia in 1177 and most of after 1170, because they're under the thumb mostly of the Egyptians. They're being exploited. The gold mines are under control of Egypt. And the Nubians themselves are not part of this international network because, again, I would say they're under the control of the Egyptians at that time. Now, going forward, yes, they are resilient and all of that. And they do make an appearance towards the end of after 1177. Where they're really going to come into their own is in the sequel to the sequel. So, and there is going to be a third book in this unintended trilogy, which is already, we have the title, now I just have to write it. It's 776 BC, The Clashing of Civilizations. And that's where Nubia is going to come into play. I will give them one of the starring roles there. But for the late Bronze Age, it's Egypt, 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 I would say. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly, right. And so Nubia comes into play during the third intermediate period, makes an appearance, and then it's basically, but wait, there's more, but you'll have to wait for the third book. So yes, yes, yeah.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I was curious about the degree to which these models are principally guided by major kingdoms, and the degree to which then these inferences are also applicable to sort of rural towns living on the periphery of these kingdoms. So
Yes.
in Upper Mesopotamia, if they're practicing cannibalism, perhaps you would expect then smaller kingdoms to be, or smaller sites to just be completely absent and decimated.
Right. So excellent question. And it has been pointed out, not just to me, but in the literature, that we are to a certain extent prioritizing the larger kingdoms and the empires and all of that. Yeah. So one thing that I would answer is in terms of the rural populations, they might not have been affected at all. They might not even known that anything was really happening, except for the drought and the earthquakes. That would have impacted them. But in terms of the rulers, somebody in Messenia might have shrugged their shoulders and just said, I wonder who I'm paying taxes to tomorrow, right? They might not have been as affected. And indeed, they probably would have survived. To a certain extent, it's the elite that is impacted by this. But that's also something I say in the sequel right at the beginning. We are affected by the sources that have been left to us. So of course the inscriptions are written by the top level. You're not going to get that many inscriptions from the rural population. So we don't actually have the information for a lot of them unless you're excavating them. And then you can make your comments that way. But the other thing that people have suggested is that maybe the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, these large empires, were in themselves an abnormality, and that maybe smaller kingdoms or city-states were the norm. And it has been suggested that the collapse of the late Bronze Age is just an experiment that finally went wrong, and that going to the Iron Age city-states is actually the more normal system, which is a possibility, in which case calling it a collapse, yes, it's still a collapse, but maybe we're going back to the way things mostly were. But the problem is, and I know I'm not answering your question properly, but it is the amount of evidence that we've got, and it really changes from place to place and from century to century. So one thing that I say at the beginning is this is going to be it's going to be different depending on when and where we're looking at. So if I could say more about the lower class and the rural population, I absolutely would. But I'm hoping now that the people that are doing the work out in those regions will now start publishing the data In effect, I'm hoping for another deluge of publications. And if people say, wait, I got to put this out, Cline is wrong, I'm like, good, perfect, wonderful. So hopefully we'll have better answers to all of that, because these are excellent questions for which we don't have all of the answers right now.
Any questions from this side of the audience?
So the rhyming scheme that you had kind of set up where, history might not repeat itself, and you said that we look to be in a similar set now. The kingdoms and societies that you had set up in, 1177, around that time frame, it seemed like the parallel that you were making obviously focused around America, but then what other set of interconnected entities would that be? I don't know exactly how to word our relationship with other people, but is it like America and allies like France and Germany and Britain, or is it going to be like global superpowers like Russia and China and America that seem to be going into this? Is it an intra-American thing that like the states themselves will fall apart? I just wanted to know what you thought that scheme would be now, because the global effect of like interconnectivity is more eminent now that we have like the internet and the ability to just like know what's happening,
Right.
say in the middle of Israel Palestine. Like the Hittites might not have known that. It's like, what's your opinion on that rhyme scheme for now?
Good question, and my answer is discuss. Because I think this is a perfect topic, is who would be involved, and I think we would get as many different answers as anybody in here. So I haven't gone that way. I haven't tried to apply it. I mean, the amount of effort I put into it is limited to a certain extent. But yes, I was totally thinking about America and its interconnections and the supply chain shortages that we've experienced, because that's all I've experienced. I haven't been elsewhere. But that would be interesting to see where you could place it. And again, just like leaving Nubia out, I left out the comments that are left under some of the lectures on YouTube are like, what about India? What about China? What about Australia? And I'm like, yeah, and I'm talking about the area of the world that I know is interconnected. You all want to talk about the rest? Make yourself at home. Which is absolutely fine. So same thing with this question. I think it's a great question, and I think each person would probably have their own, but wait, it's more like this. But I was being America-centric, if you put it that way, and thinking in terms of us collapsing. So, and what would be the domino effect? And one thing that we did, which isn't in any of these books, but I gave a lecture on the first book back in 2019 at a conference at Princeton on collapse. And at that same conference were a couple of people from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they came up afterward to me and they said, have you ever tried to actually model the collapse? I said, what do you mean? They said, the order in which people had to fall to get the result that we can see. I'm like, no, I'm not competent to do that. And they said, we are. You want to work together? And so we did, including with a mathematician from Delft, and they ran thousands of computer models. And it was published in January. I can send you the link if you want. But the basic thing that came down is if the Hittites and Egypt collapsed at about the same time, that was enough to send everybody down. And if the Hittites and Ugarit collapsed at about the same time, that was also enough to send everybody else down. No other combination worked, just those. And I said, well, historically, we know that Egypt did not collapse. It might be at number 3, but it didn't collapse. So the only thing that left to explain what we can see is the Hittites and Ugarit going down at the same time, which is nothing that I would have ever predicted. I would have said, oh, the Mycenaeans and the Assyrians, or Hittites and Assyrians. No, Ugarit and the Hittites is the only combination that the computer modeling showed. And so I thought that was really interesting, and that maybe still goes to your question if you try to put it on us today. What combination of today's society is collapsing that would result in the tipping point that would then have a cascading effect to take everybody else down with it? And I would venture, we could lecture, we could guess till the cows come home. Well, if France went down, nobody would be affected. If Belgium went down, would anybody care? It was, sorry, I love Belgium, and so on, right? So we could see what would it take for all of us to go down. But again, these are for the futurists to look at, or the computer modelers. But I think this could lead us in some very interesting directions, which again might have lessons for us today. Right? When I was interviewed by Adam Frank of NPR when the first book came out, I was all, we're much better than the Hittites. We know what causes climate change. And he's like, yeah, and are we smart enough to do anything about it? I'm like, I don't know. So all kinds of questions.
Any more questions from the section?
I'd be interested to hear more on your thoughts about the word resilience. Breaking it down into its Latin roots, literally bouncing back. I've come across some works recently that contrast this with the concept of prosilience, being prepared in the first place so you don't have to bounce back at least as much after a calamity.
Interesting.
And that reminded me a bit of the term you used, anti-fragile. But then at one point, it seemed like you were using anti-fragile like it could be actually capitalizing on the misfortune of another society that had, experienced hardship.
Right.
So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the relationship between those concepts, not to be semantically picky, but I'm just interested in resilience versus prosilience versus anti-fragile. Any thoughts you might have on that?
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I've never heard of prosilience before. This is a new one for me. I came across polycrisis the other day, but I like the idea of process. So basically being ready beforehand, being prepared, which is what I would argue we need to do in the first place, right? Be prepared ahead of time. Right. As far as resilience being bouncing back, that was exactly the way I was looking at it. I was like, okay, this is how you were before the collapse. Did you bounce back to an equal state after the collapse? Which is why I put Egypt down in 3, because I don't think they bounced back. And that was when one of the Egyptologists said, you're not being fair. Why should they have to bounce back to what it was in the Bronze Age? I'm like, because that's my definition of resilience, is bouncing back. But then you get into anti-fragile, which to me is resilience on steroids. That yes, it might be taking advantage of others' misfortune, which in some cases I think it was, with the Phoenicians perhaps. But like the Cypriots, it's not, unless they're taking advantage of a lack of tin, which is debated. So there I'm using anti-fragile as being as resilient as you can possibly be without the additional connotations. For me, like ranking it 1 through 5, anti-fragile is almost 0. It's like as best as you can be. But the other thing that I do say in the book is that this is all me. This is all my gut reaction. And it's just the way I see it after doing all of this. And I'm not only content, but happy for others to say, I disagree. I actually think it's like this, because that's the way we push the field forward. And I think it would be good like that. So, but prosilience, is that how I'm pronouncing it? Prosilience? I'll have to keep that in mind. Never heard about that, but I like it. Yeah, so being prepared before a catastrophe hits. To a certain extent, that's transforming even before everything happens. Right, so that would be kind of like Adam Frank saying, are we smart enough to realize we're going downhill before it's too late? Yeah, so that would kind of work. Yeah, all right, thank you. Yeah.
Questions from the back?
Thanks. This is really fascinating to hear you lay it all out like this. I asked this question as a Greek archaeologist. somewhat ignorant of the textual traditions of the Near East. But so in Greece, we have this kind of cultural memory of the Bronze Age and the Bronze Age collapse that may or may not be preserved, like in the Homeric epics, for instance. Do we get that elsewhere, like in southern Canaan, that's replaced by all these little kingdoms? Like Egypt, obviously, there's a long tradition of cultural memory. But for places that you say like are vanished or are replaced, like the Hittites or southern Canaan, do the people that come after have any sort of concept of those who came before them?
I think the short answer is yes, but it varies from place to place to place, right? So just like in Greece, you've got Homer writing about the Trojan War 400 or 500 years later. So I would argue that you've got the same thing elsewhere. And again, I mean, you could almost, there are people that say the Exodus is actually a memory of the Hyksos being expelled earlier. So, maybe, but think about people like Ashurbanipal creating his library so he could get the writings from the earlier. I would say yes. The Greeks are probably the easiest to point to, but yes, I think the answer would be yes. They were aware of what had gone before. I mean, it may have even been, I don't know, David and Goliath may be a memory, but who knows? But yes, I think we can go there with that. And that's actually one of the definitions of a systems collapse, is that afterward you get these memories of what it was that collapsed, and you tell stories about the heroic age that's now gone. So I think if we put our collective heads together, we could probably come up with quite a few other ones. Yeah, so I would say yes.
Thank you so much for a stimulating lecture. I wanted to go back to this idea of preparation, resilience, whatever we want to call it, and thinking about our ancient subjects. And we're talking about transformation over the course of multiple generations, perhaps, right? So how much conscious forethought or planning really goes into that? Or is this more kind of the result of a variety of different factors, maybe all these kinds of coping strategies that have the cumulative effect of looking like, preparation and transformation, right? Is some form of a environmental Darwinism, whatever we want to call it? I mean, I want to get your thoughts on this.
Right, good question. And I did try to address those questions to a certain extent, particularly in the revised version of the first book. And the question that I was asking is, first of all, were they aware that they were collapsing at the time they were collapsing? Secondly, if they were aware, did they do anything to try and either avoid it completely or mitigate it or put it off or anything like that? And it's hard to answer those, but I think that goes to kind of what you're asking. Was there a Cassandra that they ignored or whatever? There are some examples that they were aware of it and dealing with it. For instance, the Hittites asked the Egyptians for food, and the Egyptians sent grain ships. We know that from text, and indeed, the king of Ugarit, when he was writing, the Egyptians sent 7,000 dried fish to them, a relief mission. We've also got one example that Israel Finkelstein and his team have come up with, showing that the Egyptians were interbreeding cattle at that time with their normal cattle with zebu or zebu cattle, which are much more drought resistant, if you will. And so I think that shows that the Egyptians had to be aware. They were also kind of overplanting, if you will, northern Canaan, not northern Canaan, but what is now northern Israel, with grain. So I do think the Egyptians, to a certain extent, were aware of this and were trying to take steps, but it was like too little too late, if you will. I don't see any evidence yet for anybody else realizing and taking steps. And in fact, that's one thing that I put, I don't remember if it's in the sequel or the revised of the first. I am looking at the texts. Nobody is saying, hey, we're suffering from this. Or where are the Minoans these days? They stopped coming, right? Or our global network has collapsed. Like, nobody is writing contemporaneously saying that. The closest that we come now are to these new texts from Ugarit saying there's famine and there is an enemy invading. But, were they conscious of the fact that they were going down? There's no indication of that. So I think that most of them were not aware that they were on the slippery slope going down. And when they did become aware, if they did, it was too late. And for me, that then holds lessons for us today. Because, like I said, I do think I've become a doomsayer, right? You should see me doom scrolling. Oh my God, right. But I do think that we've got all the things around and we're just not paying attention to it, and how much effort would it take? Not too much. So, but I'm really curious as to whether they knew they were going down, and we don't have any answer for that yet. Yeah, and if they did know, could they have done anything about it? I think the answer to that is no, too late. But yeah, but then the question is, what's the tipping point? At what point is there a point of no return, right? And I think that also is crucial for us today. Yeah.
We'll bring the Q&A to a close there. As one final enticement for you to join us at the reception, we will be raffling off 5 copies of After 1177. All you need to do is fill out a card, and we hope to see you there. We will also be sticking around shortly for a book signing for those who are interested in purchasing a copy of Dr. Cline's books, and Professor Wang will be out front of the library in 5 minutes or so to make a trip over to the Marriott Foundation building, where we hope that you'll be able to join us. But for now, please join me in giving one final round of applause to Dr. Eric.